Chapter 11 of The People of the Mist by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. That hero, Otter. "Help me to secure the gate," said Leonard presently. In another minute the great iron bar had been dropped into its place, and Leonard withdrew the key and put it in his pocket. "Why do you secure the door, boss?" whispered Otter. "To keep the real Pierre out, in case he should come this way. 2 Pierres would be one too many at this game. Now we must win or perish." Then they crept along the embankment till they gained the shelter of the hut or barrack shed, which stood with its back to the dyke that separated the Nest from the slave camp. Happily none saw them, and there were no dogs in the place. Dogs make a noise at inconvenient times, therefore slave dealers do not love them. The end of the shed behind which they were crouching was situated some 8 or 10 paces from the drawbridge that formed the only path of entry to the slave camp. "Boss," said Otter, "let me go forward and look. My eyes are the eyes of a cat. I can see in the dark. Perhaps the bridge is down." Without waiting for an answer he crept forward on his hands and knees, so quietly that they could scarcely hear a movement. Notwithstanding his white dress, there was little chance of his being seen, for the shadow of the shed was dense, and a fringe of rushes grew along the edge of the dyke. 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes passed, and Otter did not return. Leonard's anxiety grew very keen. "Let us go and see what happened, mother," he whispered to Soa. They crept along to the end of the shed. Within a yard of it they discovered the arms and clothes of Otter. But Otter, where was he? "The Black One has deserted us," said Soa beneath her breath. "Never," answered Leonard. By now the clouds were breaking before the wind, which was rising steadily, and some stars shone out, giving a little light. The dyke lay deep between its banks and was not more than 20 feet in width, so that the air did not ruffle it. Moreover, as any observer of nature will have noticed, the surface of still water is never quite dark, even on much blacker nights than this. Why had Otter taken off his clothes, Leonard wondered? Evidently that he might go into the water. And what could he want to go into the water for, unless it was that his heart failed him, and, as Soa suggested, he had deserted. But this was impossible, for he knew well that the dwarf would die first. In his great perplexity Leonard stared at the dyke. Now he could see that on its further side rose a flight of wooden steps, protected at the top by gates, and that a man was seated on the lowest step with a rifle beside him, his feet hanging down to within inches of the surface of the dyke. It must be the sentry. Next instant Leonard saw something else. Beneath the feet of the man a ripple grew on the face of the deep water, and something gleamed in the ripple like the flash of steel. Then a small black object projected itself toward the feet of the sentry, who was half asleep and humming to himself drowsily. Suddenly he saw the man slide from his seat as though by magic. He said nothing, but making one ineffectual grasp at some rushes, he vanished into the deeps below. For a minute or more Leonard could distinguish a slight disturbance on the surface of the water, and that was all. Now he guessed what had happened. Otter had dived, and rising beneath the feet of the man, seized him, and with a sudden movement dragged him down to death by drowning. Either this, or an alligator had taken him, and that flash was the flash of his fangs. As Leonard thought thus, a dark form rose, grasping at the foot of the steps. It drew itself out of the water and slipped stealthily up them. It was Otter, and he held a knife in his hand. Now the dwarf vanished through the gates into the little guardhouse at the top of the embankment. Another minute, and ropes began to creak. Then the tall drawbridge, standing upright like a scaffold against the sky, was seen to bend itself forward. Down it came very softly, and the slave camp was open to them. Again the black shape appeared, this time on the bridge. "Come along," whispered Leonard to his companion. "That hero Otter has drowned the sentry and won the bridge. Stop, pick up his clothes and arms." At that moment Otter himself arrived. "Quick," he said, "come over, boss, before they see that the bridge is down. Give me my clothes and the gun." "All right, here they are," answered Leonard, and in another minute they were over the bridge and standing on the parapet of the slave camp. "Into the guardhouse, boss. The windlass is there, but no man." They entered. A lamp was burning in the place. Otter seized the handle of the windlass and began to wind. He was naked, and it was a wonderful sight to see the muscles starting out in knots on his huge but dwarfish frame as he strained at the weight of the bridge. Presently it was up, and leaning on the handle of the wheel, Otter chuckled aloud. "Now we are safe for a time," he said, "and I will dress myself. Let the boss forgive me for appearing thus before him, I, who am so ugly." "Tell us the tale, Otter." "It is short, boss," the dwarf replied, as he put on his robe and turban. "When I left you I watched, I who can see in the dark, and in a little while I saw the guard come down the steps and sit by the edge of the water. He was sleepy, for he yawned and lit a roll of paper to smoke it. Presently it went out, and he had no more matches. He looked up to the house there, but was too lazy to fetch them. Then I guessed that he was alone, for else he would have called to his companion for fire. Now he grew sleepier, and I said to myself, 'Otter, Otter, how can you kill this man silently? You must not shoot because of the noise, and if you throw a knife or a spear, you may miss or wound him only.' And my snake spoke in my heart and answered, 'Otter, Otter, dive, seize his feet, and drag him down swiftly and stamp him into the mud. You who are half a fish and can swim as no other man can swim. Do it at once, Otter, before the light comes and men can see the drawbridge move.' Well, and so I did it, boss. Wow! I trod him deep into the mire. I trampled him as an ox tramples corn upon the thrashing floor. Never will he come up again. After that I rose and ran into the guardhouse, fearing lest there might be another whom I must silence also, for when I was a slave two always kept watch. But the place was empty, so I let the bridge down. I remember how it worked. And that is the tale, boss." "A great tale, Otter, but it is not finished yet. Now let us to the slaves. Come, take the light and lead the way. Here we are safe, is it not so?" "Here, boss, we are safe, for none can reach us except by storm, and yonder is the big gun which turns upon itself. Let us twist the gun round first, so that, if need be, we can fire into the camp." "I don't know much of cannon," said Leonard doubtfully. "But I know something, white man," said Soa, speaking for the first time. "Mavoom, my master, has a small one up at the settlement, and often I have helped to fire it for practice, and as a signal to boats on the river, and so have many of the men who were carried away, if we can find them yonder." "Good," said Leonard. A path ran along the top of the embankment to the platform on which the gun was mounted. It was a 6-pounder muzzle loader. Leonard unhooked the rammer and ran it down the muzzle. "She is loaded," he said. "Now let us swing her around." They did so easily enough, bringing the muzzle down upon the Nest camp. Then they entered the little hut which stood alongside. Piled up in it, in case of emergency, were half a dozen rounds of grape shot and powder. "Lots of ammunition if we should want to use it," said Leonard. "It never occurred to those gentlemen that a gun can shoot two ways. And now, Otter, lead us to the slaves, quick." "This way, boss, but first we must find the tools. They are in the guard hut, I suppose." So they crept back to the hut, holding their heads as low as possible, for the light was increasing, although the moon was not yet up, and they feared lest they should be seen against the skyline. Here they found boxes containing nippers, chisels, and other instruments such as are used to undo the irons upon slaves. Also they found the keys of the padlocks that locked the iron bars to which the captives were tethered. Taking a lantern with them, but leaving another burning as before in the hut, lest its absence should excite suspicion, they passed through two strong gates and down the steps on the further side of the embankment. A few paces beyond stood the first slave shed, a rough erection supported on posts but without sides. They entered the shed, Otter leading the way with the lantern. In the middle of it was a path, and on either side of this path ran the long bars to which the captives were fastened in a double row. Perhaps there might have been 250 of them in this shed. Here the sights and scenes were such as need not be described. Of the miserable captives, some lay on the wet ground, men and women together, trying to forget their sorrows in sleep. But the most part of them were awake, and the sounds of moans ran up and down their lines like the moaning of trees in the wind. When they saw the light, the slaves ceased moaning and crouched upon the ground like dogs that await the whip, for they thought that this was a visit from their captors. Some of them, indeed, stretched out their manacled hands imploring pity, but these were the exceptions. The most of them had abandoned hope and were sunk in dull despair. It was pitiful to see the glance of their terror-filled eyes and the answering quiver of their wealed frames whenever an arm was lifted or a sudden movement made. Soa went down the line rapidly, examining the faces of the slaves. "Do you see any of Mavoom's people?" asked Leonard anxiously. "Not here, white man. Let us go to the next shed, unless you want to loose these." "No good in that, mother," said Otter. "They would only betray us." So they went to the next shed. In all there were 4, and here, at the second man who was sleeping, his head bowed on his chained hands, Soa stopped suddenly, like a pointer dog when he scents game. "Peter, Peter," she said. The man awoke. He was a fine fellow, about 30 years of age, and glared round wildly. "Who called me by my old name?" he said hoarsely. "Nay, I dream. Peter is dead." "Peter," said the woman again, "awake, child of Mavoom. It is I, Soa, who am come to save you." The man cried aloud and began to tremble, but the other slaves took no notice, thinking only that he had been smitten with a scourge. "Be silent," said Soa again, "or we are lost. Loose that bar, Black One. This is a headman from the settlement, a brave man." Soon the bar was undone. Then Otter bade Peter to hold out his wrists while he twisted off the fetters. Presently they were gone, and in the ecstasy of his recovered liberty the man leaped high into the air, then fell at Otter's feet as though he would embrace them. "Get up, you fool," said the dwarf roughly, "and if there are any more of the men of Mavoom here, show them to us quick, or you will soon be fast again." "There should be 40 or more," Peter answered, recovering himself, "besides a few women and children. The rest of us are dead, except the shepherdess alone, and she is yonder." Then they went down the lines, slipping the chains from the settlement captives. Soon they had unmanacled 10 or more men, whom Soa selected, and others stood round them, with their hands still chained. As they went about the work, Soa explained something of the position to Peter, who was fortunately a native of intelligence. He grasped the situation at once, and earnestly seconded Leonard's effort to preserve silence and to prevent confusion. "Come," said Leonard to Soa, "we've got enough to begin with. I must be off. You can loose the rest at your leisure. The moon is rising." "It is 11:15, and we have not a moment to lose. Now, Otter, before we go, how can we send men to fire the reeds? Through the garden?" "No, Baas, I have thought of a better way, the way by which I escaped myself, that is, if these men can swim." "They can all swim," said Soa. "They were bred on the banks of a river." "Good. Then they must swim down the dike where I killed the sentry, 4 of them. At the end are bars of wood, but in my day they were rotten. At the worst they can be climbed. They will find themselves in the morass among thick reeds, but they must not fire these till they have worked round to the place of the sunrise, whence the wind blows strongly. Then they must go from spot to spot, and bend down the driest of the reeds, setting fire to them. Afterwards they can get to the back of the fire and wait till all is done, one way or the other. If we win, they will find us. If we are killed, they can try to run away. But will the men go?" Soa stepped forward and chose 4 of their number. But Peter she did not choose, for he also knew something of the working of a cannon. "Listen," she said, "you have heard the words of this Black One. Now obey, and if you depart from them by one jot, may—" and she poured out so fearful a curse upon them that Leonard stared at her astonished. "Ay," added Otter, "and if I live through this I will cut your throats." "No need to threaten," said one of the men. "We will do our best for our own sakes, as well as for yours and that of the Shepherdess. We understand the plan, but to light the reeds we must have fire." "Here are matches," said Otter. "Wet matches will not light, and we must swim," answered the spokesman. "Fool, do you swim with your head under water? Tie them in your hair." "Ah, he is clever," said the spokesman. "Now if we live to reach them, when shall we fire the reeds?" "As soon as you are ready," answered Otter. "You will not come easily to the back of them. Farewell, my children. If you dare to fail, pray that you may die rather than look upon my face again." "Oh, we have seen it once. Is that not enough?" answered the spokesman, looking at Otter's huge nose with wonder, not untouched by fear. 2 minutes later the 4 men were swimming swiftly down the dike, taking their chance of the alligators. "Drop the bridge," said Leonard, "we must start." Otter lowered it, at the same time explaining its mechanism, which was very simple, to Soa, Peter, and some of the other settlement men. "Now, mother, good bye," said Leonard. "Loose all the men you can, and keep a keen look out, so as to be ready to lower the bridge if you should see us or your mistress coming towards it. If we should not come by dawn, be ready also, for then we shall probably be dead or prisoners, and you must act for yourself." "I hear you, lord," answered Soa, "and I say that you are a brave man. Whether you win or lose, the red stone is well earned already." Another minute and they were gone. Having crossed the bridge, which was instantly hoisted again, Leonard and Otter avoided observation by creeping back towards the water gate as they had come, that is, behind the shelter of the shed. Emerging from this, they ran a few yards till they were opposite the gate, then walked leisurely across the open space, a distance of 50 paces or more, to the thatched hut where the sale of slaves was carried on. There was nobody in this hut, but looking between the posts upon which it was supported, they could see by the light of the moon, now growing momentarily clearer, that a great and uproarious concourse of people was gathered beyond in front of the veranda of the Nest itself. "Come on, Otter," whispered Leonard. "We must go among these gentry. Watch me closely. Do what I do. Keep your weapons ready, and if it comes to blows, get behind my back and fight like a fiend. Above all, don't be taken prisoner." Leonard spoke calmly, but his heart was in his mouth, and his sensations were such as must have been known to Daniel when he went into the lion's den, for as in the case of the prophet, he felt that nothing short of a special providence could save him. They were round the shed now, and immediately in front of them was a mixed gathering of desperadoes, Portuguese, Arabs, bastards, and black men of various tribes, such as Leonard had never seen in all his experience. Villainy and greed were written on every countenance. It was a crew of human demons, and an extensive one. These wretches, most of whom had already drunk too freely, were drinking more, stood with their backs to them, looking toward the veranda of the Nest. On the steps of this veranda, surrounded by a choice group of companions, all of them gaudily dressed, a man was standing whom Leonard would have no difficulty in identifying as the Dom Perdita, even without Otter's warning whisper of "See, the Yellow Devil." This remarkable person demands some description, as he stood in glory that night at the apex, and though he knew it not, the conclusion of his long career of infamy. He was old, perhaps 70. His hair was white and venerable looking, and his person obese. His black eyes were small, cunning, cold, and bright, and they had the peculiarity of avoiding the face of any person with whom he chanced to be in conversation, at least when that person was looking his way. Their glance passed over him, under him, round him, anywhere but at him. As his sobriquet suggested, the colouring of Pereira's flesh was yellow, and the loose skin hung in huge wrinkles upon his cheeks. His mouth was large and coarse, and his fat hands twitched and grasped continually, as though with a desire of clutching money. For the rest, he was gorgeously dressed, and, like his companions, somewhat in liquor. Such was the outward appearance of Pereira, the fountainhead of the slave trade on this part of the coast, who was believed in his day to be the very worst man in Africa, a pre-eminence to which few can hope to attain. Until his face had been seen, stamped as it was with the traces of long and unmentionable wickedness, few honest men could guess to what depths humanity can sink. Some indeed have declared that to see him was to understand the Evil One and all his works. End of chapter 11. Of the People of the Mist by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A choice slot. At the moment of Leonard's and Otter's introduction to his society, the Yellow Devil was about to make a speech, and all eyes were fixed on him so intently that no one saw or heard the pair approach. "Now, my friends, make a path, if you please," said Leonard in a loud voice and speaking in Portuguese. "I wish to pay my respects to your chief." A dozen men wheeled round at once. "Who are you?" they cried, seeing a stranger. "If you will be so kind as to let me pass, I shall be most happy to explain," Leonard answered, pushing his way through the throng. "Who is that?" cried Pereira in coarse, thick tones. "Bring him here." "There, you hear him. Let us through, friends," said Leonard. "Let us through." Thus adjured, the throng opened the path, and Leonard and Otter passed down it, many suspicious eyes scanning them as they went. "A greeting to you, Senor," said Leonard, when they had emerged in front of the veranda. "Curse your greeting. Who in Satan's name are you?" "A humble member of your honourable profession," said Leonard coolly, come to pay his respects and do a little business." "Are you? You don't look it. You look like an Englishman. And who is that abortion, pray?" As he pointed to Otter. "I believe that you are spies, and by all saints, if you are, I am the man to deal with you." "This is a likely story," said Leonard, laughing, "that one man and a black dog should venture into the headquarters of a gentleman like you, not being of the cloth. But I think there is a noble gentleman among you, I mean the Señor Xavier, who can vouch for me. Did he not send a note to Captain Pierre, whose dhow lies in the harbour yonder, hailing from Madagascar? Well, Captain Pierre has the honour of accepting his invitation and arrives here, not without difficulty. Now he begins to think that he would have done better to stick to his ship." "That is all right, Pereira," said Xavier, a huge Portuguese with a dash of negro blood and a villainous countenance, the same man whom they had followed through the gate. "I sent a note to the Senor. I told you of it." "Then I wish you had left it alone," snarled Pereira for an answer. "I don't like your friend's looks. He might be the captain of an English man of war rigged up in our dress." At the words "English man of war," a murmur of fear and anger went through the assembly. Some of those present had experience of these hated vessels and their bigoted crews, who loved not this honest commerce, and to all they were names of ill omen. Things looked serious, and Leonard saw that he must do something, and quickly. So he lost his temper, or pretended to do so. "Curse you all for a pack of suspicious curs," he said. "I tell you that my dhow lies yonder. I am half an Englishman and half a Creole, and as good a man as any of you. Now look here, Dom Pereira, if you or any of your crew dare to doubt my word, just step out, and I will ram this down your lying throat." And placing his hand on the hilt of his sabre, he took a pace forward and scowled. The effect was instantaneous. Pereira turned a little pale beneath his yellow skin, for like most cruel men he was a great coward. "Put up your pig sticker," he said. "I see you are one of the right sort. I only wanted to try you. As you know, we must be careful in our business. Come and shake hands, brother, and be welcome. I trust you now, and old Antonio never does things by halves." "Perhaps you'd better try him a little further," said a young man who was standing near Pereira, as Leonard prepared to accept the invitation. "Send for a slave, and let us have the old test. There is none better." Pereira hesitated, and Leonard's blood turned cold. "Look here, young man," he said, more furiously than before. "I have cut the throats of more men than you have whipped, but if you want a test, I will give you one. Come down, my young cockerel, come down. There is plenty of light for comb snipping." The man turned white with rage, but stood a moment contemplating Leonard's athletic form and keen eyes. Apparently he found that in them which gave him pause, for instead of springing at him, he burst into a volume of threats and filthy abuse. How the matter would have ended it is difficult to say, but at this juncture Pereira thought it well to interfere, and vigorously. "Peace!" he thundered in his great voice, his white hair bristling with rage. "I have welcomed this man, and he is welcome. Is my word to be set aside by a drunken young brawler like you? Shut your ugly mouth, or by the saints, I will have you clapped in irons." The slave driver obeyed. Perhaps he was not sorry for an excuse to escape the quarrel. At any rate, with a scowl at Leonard, he dropped back and was silent. Harmony thus restored, Pereira proceeded with the business of the evening. First, however, he called Leonard to him, shook him by the hand, and bade a slave girl bring him drink. Then he addressed the company thus: "My lambs, my dear companions, my true and trusted friends, this is a sad moment for me, your old leader, for I stand here to bid you good bye. Tomorrow The nest will know the yellow devil no more, and you must find another captain. Alas, I grow old. I am no longer up to the work, and trade is not what it was, thanks to those infernal Englishmen and their cruisers, which prowl up and down our waters, seeking to rob honest men of the fruits of their enterprise. For nearly 50 years I have been connected with the business, and I think that the natives of these parts will remember me, not angrily, oh no, but as a benefactor. For have not some 20,000 of their young people passed through my hands, rescued by me from the curse of barbarism, and sent to learn the blessings of civilization and the arts of peace in the homes of kind and indulgent masters? Sometimes, not often, but now and again, there has been bloodshed in the course of our little expeditions. I regret it, but what will you? These people are so obstinate that they cannot see how well it is for them to come under my wing, and if they try to injure us in our good work, why, we must fight. We all know the bitterness of ingratitude, but we have to put up with it. It is a trial sent to us from heaven, my lambs. Always remember that. So I retire with such modest gains as I have won by a life of labour. Indeed, they have gone before me, lest some of you might be put in the way of temptation, to spend the evening of my day in peace and prayer. And now there is one more little thing. As it chanced during our last journey, the daughter of an accursed Englishman fell into our hands. I took her and brought her here, and as her guardian I have asked you to meet me tonight, that I may choose her a husband, as it is my duty to do. I cannot keep her myself, for among the settled people near Mozambique, where I am going to live, her presence might lead to awkward questions. So I will be generous and pass her on to another. But to whom shall I give this prize, this pearl, this sweet and lovely maid? Among so many worthy gentlemen, how can I set one above the others and declare him most deserving of the girl? I cannot, so I must leave it to chance, for I know that heaven will choose better than I. Therefore to him who is ready to make the largest present to me, I will give this maid. To comfort him with her love, to make a present, mind you, not to pay a price. Still, perhaps it will be best that the amount of the donation should be ascertained in the usual way, by bidding, in ounces of gold, if you please. One more condition. There shall be nothing irregular in this matter, my friends. The Church shall have its say in it, and he whom I select must wed the maid here before us all. Have we not a priest at hand, and shall we find no work for him? Now, my children, time draws on. Ho, you, bring out the English girl." This speech was not delivered quite so continuously as it is printed here. On the contrary, it was subject to many interruptions, mostly of an ironical nature. The allusions to a present to be given for the girl, and to the proposed marriage ceremony, being received with screams of ribald laughter. Now the noise died away, for every eye watched for the appearance of Juanna. In a few moments a figure clad in white and guarded by several men was seen advancing from the direction of the almshouse. This figure came on through the moonlight with a swift, agile step, looking neither to the right nor to the left till it arrived in front of the veranda and halted. Then it was that Leonard first saw Juanna Rodd. She was very tall and slight. Her dark hair was twisted into a single knot at the back of her shapely head. Her features were small, her face fair in colouring and somewhat rounded in form. So much he saw at a glance, but it was not until she looked up and round her that Leonard discovered the girl's peculiar glory, the glory of her eyes. Then, and in that light, he was unable to distinguish their colour, a difficult task at any time, for they varied from grey to blue according to the shadows which fell upon them, but he could see that they were wide and splendid, fearless and yet soft. For the rest, she was clad in an Arab robe, richly worked, and wore sandals upon her feet. Juanna stopped in front of the veranda and searched it with her eyes. Presently they ceased their searching, and she spoke in a clear, sweet voice. "What do you want with me now, Don Antonio Pereira?" she said. "My dove," he answered in his coarse, mocking tones. "Do not be angry with your slave. I promised you, my dove, that I would find a husband for you, and now all these gallant gentlemen are gathered for the choice. It is your marriage hour, my dove." "Dom Antonio Pereira," the girl answered, "for the last time I plead to you. I am helpless here among you. I have done you no injury. Let me go unharmed, I pray you." "Let you go unharmed? Why, who would hurt you, my dove?" answered the satyr. "Yes, that is what I mean to do. I will let you go to a husband." "I shall never go to any husband of your choosing, Don Antonio," Juanna said again in a low and steady voice. "Be assured of that, all of you. I have no fear of you, for God will help me in my need. And now, as I have pleaded to you for the last time, so for the last time I warn you, Don Antonio, and your wicked companions also. Go on with this iniquity if you will, but judgment awaits you. Death from heaven above is near to you, you murderer, and after death, vengeance." Thus she spoke, not loud indeed, but with conviction, a power, and a dignity of mien that carried terror to the hearts of the most hardened villains there. It was at the conclusion of her speech that her eyes first met those of Leonard Outram. He was bending forward to listen, and in his grief and anger he had forgotten to preserve the truculent expression which it was his part to wear. Once more Leonard's face was the face of an English gentleman, noble and open, if somewhat stern. Their eyes met, and there was that in his which caused Juanna to pause. She looked at him swiftly, as though she would read his very soul, and in answer he put all his will and heart's desire into his gaze, the will and the desire that she should know him to be her friend. They had never met before, she did not even dream of his existence, and there was little in Leonard's outward appearance to distinguish him from the ruffians by whom he was surrounded. Yet her quick sense, sharpened by despair, read what was written in his eyes, and read it aright. From that moment Juanna felt that she was not alone among these wolves, that there was one person at least who would save her if he could. In an instant she had searched his face, and dropped her eyes again, fearing lest she should awake suspicion. Then came a pause, for the minds of men were disturbed. She had aroused some remnant of conscience in them. She had called to life a lively terror of vengeance to come, of vengeance very near at hand. All were affected, more or less, but chiefly was he affected to whom she had addressed her words. The yellow devil sank back into the chair from which he had risen to speak, a wonderful chair made of ebony inlaid with ivory, and stringed seated, with a footstool attached to it. Superstitious dread took hold of him, and he shivered visibly. The scene was one which Leonard never forgot. Above the bright moon shone in the heavens. Before him were rank upon rank of evil faces, each marked with some new emotion, and standing alone in their midst was the beautiful girl, proud in the depth of her shame, defiant even in the power of foes gathered to destroy her. For a while the wind had dropped and the silence was deep. So deep was it that Leonard could hear the mew of a kitten which had crept from the veranda and was rubbing itself against Juanna's feet. She heard it also, and stooping, lifted the little creature and held it to her breast. "Let her go," said a voice from the crowd. "She is a witch, and will bring ill luck upon us." At the sound Pereira seemed to awake. With a hideous oath he flung himself from the chair and waddled down the steps towards his victim. "Curse you, you slut," he said. "Do you think to frighten men with your threats? Let God help you if he can. The yellow devil is God here. You are as much in my power as this brute," and he snatched the kitten from her arms and dashed it to the ground. "You see, God does not help the kitten, and he will not help you. Here, let men see what they are going to buy," and gripping the breast of her white robe, he rent it open. With one hand Juanna gathered up the torn dress, and with the other she began to do something to her hair. An agony of fear took hold of Leonard. He knew the story of the poison which she carried. Was she about to use it? Once again their eyes met, and there was warning in his glance. Juanna loosened her hair indeed, and let it fall about her shoulders, covering her rent robe to the waist, but she did no more. Only after Leonard saw that she kept her right hand closed, and knew that her death was hidden within it. Then she spoke once more to Pereira. "In your last hour may you remember these two deeds," she said, pointing to the writhing kitten and to her torn dress. Now slaves drew near to do their master's bidding, but that audience would not suffer this. "Leave her alone," they said. "We can see that the girl is fair and perfect." Then the slaves hung back, nor did Pereira repeat his commands. Returning to the veranda, he stood by the chair, and taking an empty glass in his hand by way of an auctioneer's hammer, he began: "Gentlemen, I am going to offer you a very choice lot, so choice that it makes up all the sale. The lot is a white girl, half English and half Portuguese by blood. She is well educated and devout. As to her docility, I can say nothing. That will be for her husband to attend to. Of her beauty I need not speak. You can all see it yourselves. Look at that figure, that hair, those eyes. Have any of you known their equal? Well, this lot will be sold to him among you who is inclined to make the largest present in compensation. Yes, he may take her this very hour, and my blessings with her. But there are conditions. He whom I approve must be lawfully married to the girl by the priest Francisco here," and turning, he pointed to a small, melancholy-looking man with a womanish face and dark blue eyes, who stood in the background, clothed in a somewhat tattered priest's robe. "Then I shall have done my duty by her. One more thing. Gentlemen, we are not going to waste time in little bids. The upset price will be 30 ounces. "Silver?" said a voice. "Silver? No, of course not. Do you think you are bidding for a nigger girl, fool? Gold, man, gold. 30 ounces of gold, and payment to be made on the nail." There was a groan of disappointment, and one ruffian cried out: "What are we poor fellows to do? 30 ounces for a beginning. Where is our chance?" "What are you to do? Why, work hard at your profession and grow rich, of course. Do you suppose that these prizes are for the poor? Now then, the fair is open. Who bids for the white girl Juanna? 30 ounces is offered. What advance? What advance?" "35," said a wizened little man with a hectic cough, who looked fitter for a burial than a bridal. "40," cried another, a pure-bred Arab of stately appearance and saturnine expression, who wished to add to his harem. "45," answered the wizened man. Then the Arab bid 50, and for a while it seemed that these two alone were competitors. When the bids had reached 70 ounces, the Arab muttered "Allah" and gave up. He preferred to wait for the houri. "Knock her down," said the wizened man. "She is mine." "Hold on a bit, my little friend," said the great Portuguese Xavier, who had passed the water gate before Leonard and his companions. "I am going to begin now. 75. 80, said the little man. 85, answered Xavier. 90, screamed the other. 95, said Xavier. 100, yelled the small man, snapping his fingers. 105, replied Xavier, triumphantly capping his bid. Then with a curse his antagonist gave up also, and the mob shouted, thinking that Xavier had won. "Knock her down, Pereira," said Xavier in his turn, as he surveyed his prize with affected nonchalance. "Wait a moment," put in Leonard, speaking for the first time. "I am going to begin now. 110." The multitude shouted again. The contest was growing exciting. Xavier glared at Leonard and bit his fingers with rage. He was very near his limit of possible expenditure. "Now then," cried Pereira, licking his lips for joy, since the price had already run 20 ounces higher than he expected. "Now then, friend Xavier, am I to knock down this beauty to the stranger Captain Pierre? It sounds a lot, but she is cheap at the price, dirt cheap. Look at her and bid up, but mind, it is cash down, no credit, no, not for an ounce." 115, said Xavier, with the air of a man making his last throw for fortune. 120, replied Leonard quietly. He had bid to the last ounce in his possession, and if Xavier went further he must give in, unless indeed he chose to offer Soa's ruby in payment. This, needless to say, he was not anxious to do. No one would believe a stone of that size to be genuine. Of all this, however, Leonard showed nothing in his face, but turning coolly, he called to the slave girl to bring him spirits and busied himself with filling his glass. His hand never trembled, for he knew well that his antagonist was watching for a cue, and if he showed uncertainty all might be lost. But in his heart Leonard wondered what he should do if another ounce was bid. Meanwhile the spectators were shouting encouragement, and Pereira was urging Xavier to increase his offer. For a while the Portuguese hesitated, surveying Juanna, who stood pale and silent, her head bowed upon her breast. At this juncture Leonard turned, the glass still in his hand. "Did you make any advance, Senor?" he asked. "No, curse you, take her. I will not put down another ounce for her or any woman on the earth." Leonard only smiled and looked at Pereira. "Going," said that worthy, "the white girl Juanna is going to the stranger Pierre for 120 ounces of gold. Going? Come, Xavier, don't lose her. If you do, you will only be sorry once, and that will be always. Now for the last time," and he lifted his glass in his hand and paused. Xavier made a step forward and opened his lips to speak. Leonard's heart stood still, but presently the Portuguese changed his mind and turned away. "Go on," screamed Pereira, bringing the glass down so heavily on the arm of his chair that it flew into fragments. End of chapter 12. Of the People of the Mist by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Midnight Marriage. "Go on," said Pereira again. "Now, friend Pierre, before we ratify this matter by the aid of Holy Church, perhaps you will table the gold. This is a cash transaction, remember." "Certainly," answered Leonard. "Where is that black dog of mine, the dwarf? Ah, there he is. Dog, weigh out the stuff. If you have not enough, here is more," and he unbuckled his belt, from which he had been careful to extract the ruby, and threw it to Otter. "Now, gentlemen and companions," he went on, "for I hope that we may do business together by and by, drink my health and my bride's. I have paid pretty dear for her, but what of it? A gentleman of our profession should always be ready to back his fancy, for if his is apt to be a short life, he may as well make it a merry one." "She will think better of you, and you of her," cried a voice. "Here is to Captain Pierre and the girl," and they drank shouting aloud in their half-drunken merriment. Meanwhile, Otter, advancing with obsequious steps, was pouring handful after handful of gold coin and ingots into the large scales which Pereira caused to be held before him. At length all the gold was in, a shining heap. "The balance does not turn," said Xavier. "I claim the girl." "Baas," said Otter in a low voice, and speaking in Dutch, "have you more gold? The weight is short." Leonard glanced carelessly at the scales. They were trembling on the turn. "As much as you like," he said, "but here is what will do it." And drawing off his signet ring, he threw it on the pile. The ruby accepted, it was the last thing of value that he had about him. Then the scale vibrated and sank down. "Good," said Pereira, rubbing his hands at the sight of so much treasure. "Bring me that acid that I may test the stuff. No offence, stranger Pierre, but this is a wicked world in which brass has passed for gold before to-day." The acid was brought and the ingots were tested at hazard, Pereira holding them up to the light of a lamp. "They are good," he said. "Now, Father, do your part." The priest Francisco stepped forward. He was very pale and seemed terrified. Leonard, watching him, wondered what had brought him into such company, for the man's face was good and even refined. "Dom Antonio," said the priest in a soft girlish voice, "I protest against this. Fate has brought me among you, though not of my own will, and I have been forced to bear the sight of much evil, but I have wrought none. I have shriven the dying, I have ministered to the sick, I have comforted the oppressed, but I have taken no share of the price of blood. I am a priest of our holy church, and if I wed these two before the sight of men, they will be husband and wife till death, and I shall have set the seal of the blessing of the church upon an act of shame. I will not do it." "You will not do it? You shaveling traitor!" screamed Pereira in a voice hoarse with rage. "Do you want to follow your brother then? Look here, my friend, either you obey me and marry these two, or—" and he hissed a horrible threat. "No, no," said Leonard, anxious to find an escape from this abominable mockery. "Let him be. What do the cheat's prayers matter? The lady and I can do without them." "I tell you, stranger, that you shall marry the girl, and this sniveller must marry you. If you don't, I will keep both her and the gold, and as for him, he can choose. Here, slaves, bring the sjambok." Francisco's delicate face flushed pink. "I am no hero that I can suffer thus," he said. "I will do your bidding, Dom Antonio, and may God forgive me the sin. For you, Pierre and Juanna, I am about to make you man and wife, to join you in a sacrament that is none the less holy and indissoluble because of the dreadful circumstances under which it is celebrated. I say to you, Pierre, abandon your wickedness and love and cherish this woman, lest a curse from heaven fall upon you. I say to you, Juanna, put your trust in God, the God of the fatherless and oppressed, who will avenge your wrongs and forgive me. Let water be brought, that I may consecrate it, water and a ring." "Here, take this one," said Pereira, lifting Leonard's signet ring from the pile of gold. "I give it back for a luck penny." And he tossed the ring to the priest. Water was brought in a basin, and the father consecrated it. Then he bade Leonard stand by the girl, and motioned the crowd to fall back from them. All this while Leonard had been watching Juanna. She said no word, and her face was calm, but her eyes told him the terror and perplexity which tore her heart. Once or twice she lifted her clenched right hand toward her lips, then dropped it without touching them. Leonard knew but too well what deed she meditated. He knew also the deadly nature of the drug she carried. If once it touched her tongue—
The suspense was terrible. He could bear it no longer. Even at the risk of discovery, he must speak with her. In obedience to the priest's direction, he sauntered to her side, laughing. Then, still laughing, with his hand he separated the tresses of dark hair, as though to look at the beauty of her side face, and bent down as if to kiss her. She stood pale and rigid, but once more her hand was lifted towards her mouth. "Stop," he whispered swiftly into her ear, speaking in English. "I have come to rescue you. Go through with this farce. It means nothing. Then, if I bid you, run for the drawbridge into the slave camp." She heard. A light of intelligence shone in her eyes, and her hand fell again. "Come, stop that, friend Pierre," said Pereira suspiciously. "What are you whispering about?" "I was telling the bride how beautiful I think her," he answered carelessly. Juanna turned and flashed on him a well-simulated glance of hate and scorn. Then the service began. The young priest was gifted with a low and beautiful voice, and by the light of the moon he read the ritual of marriage so solemnly that even the villains who stood round ceased their jokes and sneers and were silent. All things were done in order, though Juanna made no reply to the usual questions. With much sham courtesy the loathsome Pereira presided over the ceremony. Their hands were joined, the ring was set upon Juanna's finger, the blessing was pronounced, and it was finished. All this while Leonard stood like a man in a dream. He felt as though he were really being married, even when it came into his mind, as he looked upon the loveliness of the mock bride at his side, that a worse fate might befall him. Then of a sudden he woke from his reverie. The farce was played. Now they must strive to escape. "There, that is done with, Don Antonio," he said, "and I think I heard this lady whisper that with your permission we will bid you good-bye. My canoe—" "Nonsense, you will stop here tonight," said Pereira. "Thanks, I think not," answered Leonard. "Tomorrow I may return to do a little business of another kind. I have a commission for about 50 at a good price for the right sort." As Leonard spoke thus, glancing to the east, he saw dense masses of vapour rising into the air far away. The damp reeds were fired at last. The settlement men had not failed in their task, and soon the flames would be discovered. He must be gone, and swiftly. "Well, if you must, you must," answered Pereira, and Leonard observed that he looked relieved as he said it. He did not know the reason at that time. It was this: Juanna had told him that the man who bought her would find his death in it. He had a superstitious fear of the girl, and believed her. Therefore he was glad that her purchaser should go, lest it might be said that he murdered him in order to retain both the woman and her price. So he bade him farewell, and Leonard turned to depart, followed by Otter and Juanna, whom he led by the hand. All might have gone well for that time had it not been for an unlucky chance. Leonard's scheme was to walk towards the water gate, but, if no better plan of reaching it should offer, to turn suddenly and run for the drawbridge where Soa and the others would be waiting, and thence, with or without the people of Mavoom, to escape up the banks of the Zambesi. Already he had started when the great Portuguese, Xavier, who was watching, plunged in sullen thought, stepped forward. "At least I will have a kiss for my trouble," he said, and seizing Juanna round the waist, he drew her towards him. Then it was that Leonard forgot his caution, as under such circumstances a man, with nerves already strained to breaking point, well might do. Doubling his fist, he struck the giant in the face with such force that Xavier fell headlong to the ground, dragging Juanna after him. Leonard would have done better had he suffered her to be insulted, but just then he remembered only that he was protecting a helpless girl. Juanna was up in a moment and at his side. Xavier also sprang to his feet, cursing with fury and drawing his sabre as he rose. "Follow me," said Leonard to Juanna and Otter. Then without more ado he took to his heels. A shout of laughter went up from the mob. "This is the brave man, this is the French fire eater," they cried. "He strikes unawares and is afraid to fight." Nor did they stop at words. All of them were jealous of the stranger, and would have rejoiced to see him dead. "Stop him!" they shouted, and many of the men started, running like dogs to turn a hare. Still Leonard might have won through, for he was swift of foot, but neither Juanna nor Otter could run so fast as he, and his pace must be their pace. Before he had gone 100 yards he found himself confronted by a dozen or more of the slavers, some of whom had knives in their hands. "Stop, cowards, stop and fight!" they yelled in Portuguese and Arabic, waving their weapons in his face. "Certainly," answered Leonard, wheeling round and glancing about him. There, not 30 yards away, was the drawbridge of the slave camp, and he thought that he saw it tremble, as if it were about to fall. At his side were Otter and Juanna, and towards him, his hideous face red with blood, rushed the great Portuguese, sabre aloft and screaming imprecations. "Otter," Leonard said quickly, as he drew his sword, "guard my back, for when I have killed this one the rest will spring. For you, young lady, reach the bridge if you can. Soa and your people are there." Now Xavier was upon him with a rush. He struck furiously, and Leonard avoided the blow, springing backwards out of his reach. Twice more he rushed on thus, and twice he smote, but each time Leonard ran backward towards the drawbridge, that now was not more than 20 yards away. A fourth time the Portuguese came on, and the Englishman could not repeat his tactics, for the mob hemmed him in behind. On sped Xavier and smote his hardest. Leonard saw the steel gleam in the moonlight and lifted his sword to guard. The blow fell, the fire sprang from it in sparks, and down rattled fragments of shattered steel. His sword was broken. "Fight on, boss," said the voice of Otter, "fight on. Both swords have gone." Leonard looked up. It was true. The Portuguese was casting aside his broken weapon and clutching at his knife. Now Leonard had no knife, and at the moment he never thought of his revolver. But he still held the hilt of his sword, and with it he sprang straight at Xavier, who rushed to meet him. They met with a dull shock, as bull meets bull. Leonard struck one blow with the broken sword hilt, then dropped it. It was useless. But the stroke did him good service, for falling on the right hand of the Portuguese, it paralysed his arm for a second, causing him to let fall the dagger. Then they gripped each other, fighting desperately with their naked strength alone. Twice the huge Portuguese lifted the Englishman from the ground, striving to throw him, while the crowd yelled with excitement. But twice he failed. Not for nothing had Leonard learnt wrestling as a lad, and hardened his iron muscles by years of toil. Xavier may have weighed 16 stone, and Leonard did not weigh 13, but his arms were like bars of steel, and he was struggling for dear life. He waited a while, letting the Portuguese exhaust himself in efforts to hurl him to the ground. Then suddenly tightening his grip, Leonard put out all his strength. He could not hope to lift the man, that he knew, but he might throw him. With a sudden movement he hooked his right leg behind Xavier's left calf, then cast his weight forward and pushed with all his strength upon the great man's breast. Xavier tottered, recovered himself, tottered again, and strove to shift his leg. Leonard felt the movement and met it with a supreme effort. Losing his balance, his foe swayed slowly backwards like a falling tree, then fell with a thud that shook the ground. It was a gallant throw, and even the ranks of Tusculum, as represented by the slave drivers, could scarce forbear to cheer. Now Leonard lay upon the breast of the man, for he was dragged to earth with him. For a moment his enemy was still, breathing stentoriously, for the shock of their fall had been great. Leonard looked round. There, some 8 feet away, was the knife, and he who could grasp it must win this deadly game. But how could he grasp it? Xavier, whose strength and powers were coming back, still hugged him in his fearful grip. He also saw the knife, and would win it. Rapidly, by instinct almost, Leonard measured the distance with his eye. There was but one plan: to roll to it. The first roll would leave him undermost, but the dagger would still be out of Xavier's reach. Then, could he succeed in turning him upon his back once more, Leonard would be uppermost again, and if he was able to free his hand it might grasp the weapon. It was a terrible risk, but he must take it. He lay motionless a while, husbanding his force, and the Portuguese surged and heaved beneath him. He could feel the muscles of this mighty frame start up in knots as he struggled. At last Leonard let him have his way, and over they went, the two of them. Now Xavier was uppermost, and the mob yelled in triumph, for they thought that the stranger's strength was spent. "The knife! The knife!" gasped Xavier, and one of his servants sprang forward to give it to him. But Otter was watching, and started out of the press, naked sabre in hand. His fierce and ugly face was twitching with excitement. His black eyes shone, and his vast shoulders worked to and fro. To Juanna, fascinated by the fearful struggle, the dwarf looked like some black gnome, like a thing of supernatural power, half toad, half human. "He who touches the knife dies," he said in guttural Arabic, stretching his long arm and sabre over it. "Let these cocks fight it out, my masters." The man shrank back. He also was afraid of Otter, deeming him uncanny, nor did any other interfere. Now came the moment of death or victory. As he could not reach the weapon, with a sudden movement Xavier freed his right hand and grasped the Englishman's throat, but to do this he must lessen the pressure on his breast. Leonard felt the grip, and the knowledge that his end was at hand renewed his powers. Twice he writhed like a snake, gripping the ground with the muscles of his back and legs. Once he swung his frame to the right, then a vast effort, and lo, Xavier turned slowly over like a log of wood, and again Leonard lay upon his breast. Leonard lay upon his breast, and his right arm was free and within reach of the dagger, but the giant's grasp of his throat was cruel. The blood drummed in his ears, and his senses began to fail. No, he would not die thus and leave the girl helpless. Where was it? He was blind. He could see nothing but her white face. He must get free. Ah, he knew now. They thought that he was spent. See, his head fell, when suddenly he lifted himself and heaved up his arm. Crash! It came full on the forehead of Xavier, that in its turn was pillowed on the stony earth. The grip slackened. Crash again, a fearful and despairing blow. Leonard's throat was free, and the air rushed into his bursting lungs. Now he could see and grasp the knife, but there was no need to use it. The great man beneath him flung his arms wide, shivered, and grew still. Then it was, while men paused wondering at those awful blows, that Juanna, mindful of her deliverer's bidding, turned and fled, sick at heart but unhindered, to the edge of the ditch opposite the drawbridge. Otter also rushed up and dragged Leonard from the ground. "Wow!" he cried, "a good fight and a great blow. Dead by my mother's spirit, and no touch of steel. Awake, my father, awake, for if the boar is down, the pigs remain." Leonard heard his words dimly and knew their import. With an effort he ceased to stagger and rested his weight upon the dwarf, much as a man might lean upon some sturdy post. His breath came back to him and his mind cleared. He looked round and saw Juanna standing near the bridge like one who hesitates whether to fly or stay. "Sirs," gasped Leonard, "I have fought and I have won. Now let me go in peace with the girl. Is the man alive?" A ring of men had crowded round the body of Xavier, and in their centre knelt the priest Francisco. At this moment he rose and said, "It is useless to minister to him. He is no more." The slavers looked at Leonard with awe not unmixed with admiration. Who had ever seen such a thing, that one whose strength had been a byword should be slain with the naked fist? They forgot that it is easy to kill a man whose head rests upon a stone. Presently, however, their wonder gave way to rage. Xavier had been a favourite among them, and they were not minded that he should die unavenged. So they drew round Leonard, scowling and cursing. "Stand back," he said, "and let me pass. I fought your friend fairly. Had I wished to take advantage of him, should I not have used this?" And for the first time he remembered and drew his Colt, the sight of which cooled their ardour somewhat, for they gave way. "Perhaps you will give me an arm, Father," Leonard went on, speaking to the priest, who was standing by. "I am much shaken." Francisco complied, and they started towards Juanna, Otter guarding their rear with his sabre. Before they had gone 10 yards, however, Pereira waddled towards them after a hasty consultation with one of his captains. "Seize that man!" he shouted. "He has killed the worthy Dom Xavier, having first insulted him. He has slain him by violence, and he must answer for it." A dozen ruffians sprang forward at his bidding, only to be met by the sabre and pistol of Otter, with neither of which were they anxious to make a closer acquaintance. Leonard saw that the position was very grave, and a thought came into his mind. "You wish to escape from this place, Father?" he said rapidly to the priest. "Yes," answered Francisco, "it is a hell." "Then lead me as swiftly as you may to that bridge. I am hurt and weak, but there is succour beyond." As he spoke, the drawbridge, which was not 10 yards away, fell with a crash. "Run across, Juanna Rodd," cried Leonard in English. She hesitated, then obeyed. It seemed to Leonard that the look upon her face said, "How can I leave you?" "Now, Father," said Leonard, "make a rush for it." And leaning on the priest's shoulder, he stumbled towards the bridge, but he would never have reached it had it not been for Otter. "Treason!" roared Pereira. "Stop him! Who let down the bridge?" A man came on the attack. It was the same young captain that Leonard had offered to fight before the auction. In his hand was a knife already uplifted to fall on Leonard's back when Otter's sabre flashed and the man went down. "Seize the bridge and hold it!" roared Pereira again. Wind up!" yelled Otter in answer, as with the sabre and pistol he held back the mob. Those on the further side obeyed with such a will that Leonard and the priest rolled down the slanting planks. "Otter!" cried Leonard. "Good God, he will be killed!" By way of answer, Otter fired the last barrel of his pistol. Then with a yell, before his foes could close upon him, he sprang like a wild cat straight at the iron chains of the bridge, which were used to secure it in its place when needful. At the moment They hung 4 feet or more above his head, but he grasped them and shouted to Soa to hoist away. A man attempted to seize his legs, but Otter kicked him in the face and he fell into the water. Next second he was out of their reach and rapidly rising high into the air. Some threw knives and some fired pistol shots after him, but none of these touched him. "Ah, Yellow Devil," the dwarf cried as he swung, "look behind you. There is another devil, yellower and fiercer than you." Pereira turned and all his company with him, and at that moment, with a crackling roar, a vast sheet of flame burst up from the morass. The reeds had caught at last in good earnest, and the strengthening wind was bringing the fire down upon them. End of chapter 13. Of the People of the Mist by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Vengeance. "Treachery! Treachery!" screamed Pereira. "The reeds are fired, and that witch has betrayed us." "Ha ha ha ha!" cried Otter again from his airy perch. "Treachery! Treachery! And what if the slaves are loosed? And what if the gates be barred?" Hitherto the mob had been silent in their fear and wonder. There they stood closely packed, 100 or more of them, staring first at Otter, then at the advancing flames. Now they found tongue. "He is a fiend! Kill him! Storm the slave camp! To the gates!" they yelled in this language and in that. For many it was their last earthly cry, since at that moment a sheet of flame burst from the rampart of the camp, followed by the boom of the cannon, and 6 pounds of canister swept through the crowd. Right through them it swept, leaving a wide lane of dead and dying, and such a shriek went up to the heaven as even that place of torment had never heard. Then they broke and fled this way and that, screaming curses as they went. When Leonard and the priest had rolled down the rising bridge, they found Juanna standing safely by the guardhouse, surrounded by some of the settlement men. "To the gun!" he cried, "to the gun! Fire into them! I will follow you." Then it was that he saw Otter left to his death and called out in fear. But Otter saved himself, as has been told, and clambered down the bridge safe and sound. Leaning on the dwarf and Francisco, Leonard, followed by Juanna, staggered along the earthwork to the place where the gun was mounted. Before he had gone a step he caught sight of the figure of Soa, outlined in bold relief against the background of the fire and surrounded by many of the freed settlement men. At the instant when he saw her, she was in the act of springing back from the breech of the gun, the lanyard in her hand. Then came the roar of the shot and the shriek of the smitten. "Wow!" said Otter. "The old woman has not been idle. She is clever as a man, that one." Another minute and they were helping to reload the piece, that is, except Soa, who was on her knees kissing Juanna's hands. "Come, stop that," said Leonard, sinking to the ground, for he was utterly exhausted. "Those devils have gone for their arms. They will try to storm us presently. Is the shot home, Peter? Then run her out, sharp. And you, Soa, screw her nose down." Next he bade the freed slaves arm themselves with stakes or anything they could find, for of rifles they had but 4, 2 of which they had found in the guardhouse. Presently the slavers came on with a yell, carrying long planks, by the help of which they hoped to cross the dike. "Look out," said Leonard, "they are going to open fire. Under the earthwork, every man of you," and seizing Juanna, who was standing near, he pulled her down into cover. It was not too soon, for next instant a storm of bullets swept over them. Most of the men had understood and taken shelter, but some were too slow or too stupid. One of these fell dead, and two more were hit. Soa and Peter alone took no heed, and yet they remained unhurt. There stood the woman while the bullets whistled round her, laying the gun as coolly as though she had served in the Royal Artillery, and with her was the head man, Peter. Peter was shot through the waistcloth, and a ball cut its way through Soa's grizzled hair, but neither of them seemed to notice these trifles. "They are mad, Baas," cried Otter, who was watching the enemy over the top of the embankment. "See, they are coming across the open." Leonard looked. The dwarf was right. In their rage and hurry the slavers, half hidden in a cloud of smoke caused by their rapid firing, were advancing across the clear space instead of creeping along the edge of the dyke. What was more, the necessity of carrying the planks caused them to pack in groups. Soa gave a final twist with her lever and waited, her hand on the lanyard. A bullet cut it in two, but without firing the gun, and she grasped the shortened cord. "Now for it," cried Leonard, as the first party came into the line of fire. Soa sprang backwards with a yell. Again the piece thundered out, and the canister screamed through the air. It tore along the advancing files, then, striking the beaten earth, rebounded and caught those who were following with a ricochet, and with awful effect. Whole groups were mowed down by this one discharge, the destruction being twice as large as that caused by the first shot, for at this greater range the canister found room to spread. Also, the rebounding missiles flying hither and thither among the crowd did no little execution. Down went the men in heaps, and with them the planks they carried. They had no more wish to storm the slave camp. They had but one thought left, the thought of safety, and the survivors of them fled in all directions, yelling with fear and fury. Load up," cried Otter, lifting the charge of powder which lay at hand. "They will try to break open the gates and get out. Then they will cut us off." As he spoke, they saw many men run from the auction shed to the water gate, but it could not be climbed. The key was gone, and the massive bolts and beams were not easy to break. So they brought hammers and a tree trunk which had supported an angle of the shed, and battered at the gate. For 2 minutes or more it held, then it began to give. "Swift, swift," cried Otter again, as he dragged at the cannon to turn it, "or all will yet be lost." "Hurry no man's ox, Black One," said Soa, as she laid the gun with the help of Peter. A cry went up from the slavers. The gate was tottering, but it still held by the upper hinges. A few more blows and it must surely fall. But those blows were never struck. Again Soa sprang backward, and the roar of the gun was answered by the screams of the slavers as the shrapnel ploughed through them. Of those who were left, the most part fled for shelter to the auction hut and the Nest itself. Some ran across to the magazine, but appeared to be unable to enter it, for soon they were seen flying back again, while about a dozen of the boldest remained at the gate, trying to complete its destruction. On these Leonard and Otter opened fire with rifles, but it was not until 3 or 4 of them had fallen that the rest fled to join their companions beneath the shelter of the sheds. "Oh, look, look," said Juanna, pointing to the east. It was indeed a spectacle never to be forgotten. The dense reeds, measuring 12 to 15 feet in height, had been fired far to the east of the Nest, and as the wind gathered to a gale, the fire got firmer hold. It rolled down upon the doomed place in billows and sheets, a sea of flame that sometimes sprouted high into the air and sometimes ran swiftly along the ground. The reeds crackled and roared like musketry as the fire ate into them, giving out thick volumes of smoke. At first this smoke had passed above the spectators, Now it blew into their faces, half choking them and blotting out the sky, and mixing up with it were showers of sparks and fragments of burning reeds brought forward on the wind. "The house and sheds will soon catch now," said Leonard. "Then they must take refuge in the open spaces, where we can deal with them," and he nodded towards the gun. As he spoke, tongues of flame darted into the air, first from the thatch of the shed, then from the roof of the nest. They were afire. "We must be careful, Baas," said Otter, "or the slave shelters behind us will burn also, and all those in them." "Heavens, I never thought of that," answered Leonard. "Here, Father, if you wish to do a good work, take some of these people and the buckets they use to water the slaves. Let 3 or 4 men get on to each roof and extinguish the sparks as they fall, while others bring them water from the moat." The priest sprang up and set to the task, at which he laboured gallantly for 2 long hours. Had it not been for his efforts, the sheds and the slaves in them must have been burnt, for the sparks fell thick upon the dry thatch, which caught again and again. Now the sights and sounds grew more and more fearful. Maddened with fear, the remainder of the slave drivers and their servants rushed from the flaming buildings, striving to escape from the fire. Some flung themselves desperately into the aloes and prickly pears on the inner rampart, and, climbing the palisade beyond, escaped into the marsh, while some collected on the open space, and at these the guns were fired from time to time when the smoke lifted. Others again ran to the dyke of the slave camp begging for mercy, there to be shot by Otter, who never wearied in his task of revenge. From behind them also rose the hideous cries of the slaves, who believed that they were about to be burned alive, and screamed as they dragged at their manacles. "Oh, it is like hell," said Juanna to Leonard, as she buried her face in the grass that she might see no more, and to escape the suffocating smoke. She was right. So the time went on. One by one the roofs of the various buildings fell in, and spouts of flame shot high into the air to descend about them in a rain of sparks. But at last the cries ceased, for even the slaves could yell no more. The fire grew less and less, and the wind dropped. Then the sun rose on the scene of death and desolation. The morass was swept bare to the depth of many hundred yards, and the camp was a smoking ruin, strewn with the dead. The walls of the nest still stood, however, and here and there a charred post remained. Everything else was gone, except the magazine, which had escaped the flames, being built of brick and stone, and roofed with tin. The adventurers looked around them in silence. Then they looked at each other. What a spectacle they presented in the clear light of the morning, as they stood by the gun which had done them such signal service. All were begrimed with smoke and powder, and their clothes were burnt by the falling sparks. Leonard's throat was a mass of bruises, his hands and face were bleeding, and he was so stiff and hurt that he could scarcely move. Soa's hair was singed and cut by the bullet which had shaved her head. The priest's robe hung in charred threads, and his hands were blistered with fire. Juanna's broidered Arab dress, torn by the brutal hand of Pereira, scarcely retained a trace of white, and her long dark locks were tangled and powdered with bits of blackened reed. All were utterly exhausted, that is, all except Otter, who advanced to speak to Leonard, begrimed and stripped to the waist, but fresh and fierce as ever. "What is it, Otter?" he asked. "Will the boss let me take these men?" and he nodded towards the freed slaves who had belonged to the settlement, "and hunt through the camp yonder? Many of the devils still live, and wounded snakes strike hardest." "As you like," answered Leonard. "Arm them with anything you can find, and search the camp thoroughly. but be careful." In 10 minutes Otter was gone with the men. Then Leonard and the others fetched water and washed as best they might, the guardhouse being assigned to Juanna and Soa, who made their toilet with the help of a comb they found in it. There also they discovered food, the rations of the sentry, of which they ate with such appetite as they might, and a plentiful supply of meal for the slaves. As they were finishing their breakfast, Otter returned, unharmed, though of the men who accompanied him 5 were missing. With him also were 2 of the 4 settlement men who had been sent to fire the reeds on the previous night. They were much exhausted, for their task had been no easy one, and fortunately for Leonard it was only after long delay that they succeeded in it. Their 2 companions were dead. One had been taken by an alligator in the water, and the other had fallen into a deep hole in the morass and, striking his head against a log, was drowned there. "Is it finished?" said Leonard to the dwarf. Otter nodded. "Some are dead and some are fled," he answered, "but from these last we have little to fear, for they believe that an army has come against them. Still, that is not all the tale, Boss. We have taken one of them alive. Come and look at him, Boss." Leonard clambered up the steps of the embankment, followed by the others. On its further side stood the group of settlement men who had returned from scouting the camp, thin and haggard fellows, scarred by the slave irons, but very fierce-looking. In their midst a white man crouched upon the ground, moaning with terror and misery. Just then he lifted his face. It was that of the Yellow Devil himself. There lay that aged iniquity, the hoary shame, caught at last in his own snares. "Where did you find him, Otter?" asked Leonard, as they crossed the drawbridge. "In the magazine, Boss, and your gold with him. Also many rifles and much powder. He had locked himself up there, but he had not the heart to fire the powder and make an end." Pereira did not see them as yet, but raising his head he begged for water. "Give him blood," said one of the men sullenly. "He has drunk it all his days. Let it be his last drink." Leonard motioned to Francisco the priest to bring water, and then Pereira saw them and began to pray for mercy. "Antonio Pereira," Leonard answered sternly, "last night I and 2 companions, a woman and a black dwarf, set ourselves a task to take this armed place of yours and rescue a white girl whom you had condemned to slavery. It did not seem possible that we should do it, but between sunset and sunrise we have done it. Who helped us then, that we should have carried out this thing which was impossible? I will tell you. God helped us, as he helped this lady when she called on him. Cry to God then to do that which is still more impossible, to help you. From me you will have justice and no more." For a moment Pereira ceased whining, and a flash of the old ferocity came into his eyes. "Ah, my friend," he muttered, "if I had but known." Then turning to Juanna he said, "My dove, have I not treated you kindly? Will you say no word for me, now that my enemies prevail against me?" By way of answer Juanna looked first at the human reptile before her, and next at the bosom of her torn dress, now roughly pinned up with the spikes of aloe leaves. Then she turned and went. "Baas," said Otter, "may I speak?" "Speak on," Leonard answered. "Hearken, Yellow Devil," said the dwarf. 10 years ago you took me, and I lay in this camp a slave, yes, in yonder shed. Here are the marks of the irons, your own seal. Ah, you have forgotten the black dwarf, or perhaps you never noticed him, but he remembers. Who could forget you, Yellow Devil, that once had slept beneath your roof? I escaped, but as I fled I swore that, if I might, I would bring vengeance upon you. The years went by, and the hour came at last. I led Baas to this place. I found you this morning. and we are not parted yet, Yellow Devil. What did you boast last night? That you had sent 20,000 of us black people to slavery? Yes, and for every one that you have sold, you have killed 5, old men, white with years, women with child, little children at the breast. You have murdered them all. Ah, yes, I have seen you laugh and kill them before the eyes of their mothers, as last night you killed the kitten. And now your time has come at last, Yellow Devil, and I, Otter the dwarf, will give you to drink of your own medicine. What? You cry for mercy? You who never gave it, even in a dream? I tell you, did my chief yonder bid me loose you, I would disobey him even to force. I, who would rather die than put aside his word on any other matter. Look now at these men, and he pointed to the settlement people, who glared hungrily at the crouching wretch, much as hounds glare at a fox that is held aloft by the huntsman. Look at them. Do you see mercy in their eyes? Those whose fathers and mothers you have murdered, whose little children you have stamped to death. Wow, Yellow Devil, the white men tell us of a hell, a place where dead people are tormented. We know nothing of that. It is for the white people, and they may keep it all to themselves. Now you are beginning to taste that hell of yours, only beginning, Yellow Devil. Boss Leonard, I demand that this man be tried by us and dealt with according to our customs, for it is against black folk that he has sinned most of all, and we ask his blood in payment for our blood. What? Howled Pereira. Am I to be given over to these black dogs? Mercy, mercy! Francisco, plead for me, shrive me. I know I killed your brother. I had to do it. Plead for me. And he rolled in the dust, trying to clasp Leonard's feet. I cannot shrive you, answered the priest, shuddering, but I will pray for you. Then the hungry-eyed natives pounced upon Pereira to drag him thence, but Leonard broke through them, saying, I will have none of your savage cruelties here. Let the man be shot if you will, but no more. As it chanced, however, Pereira was not destined to die by the hand of man, for even as Otter gripped him, he turned livid, threw up his arms, groaned, and fell to the earth. Leonard looked at him. He was dead, dead through the fear of death, for terror had stopped the beating of his wicked heart. The shepherdess prophesied truly, cried Otter presently, for the heavens have robbed us of our vengeance. Wow, it is hard, but at least this one shall work no more evil. Carry it away, said Leonard with a shudder, for the dead man's face was ghastly to behold. Then turning to him as if nothing had happened, he added, Otter, take these men and loose the rest of the slaves. Then get the ammunition, rifles and stores from the arms-house and bring them to the water gate. We must clear out of this place at once, or we shall have the escaped slavers and the crews of the dhows down upon us. Thus did fate at last find out Antonio Pereira, the Yellow Devil. End of chapter 14. Of the People of the Mist by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Disillusion. Once more it was morning, and the travellers were encamped by that reedy point where they had left the big boats which they cut loose from the island. From the earliest dawn, Leonard had been superintending the transport across the river of the hundreds of slaves whom they had released. They there were put on shore by the settlement men, provided with a store of meal, and left to shift for themselves, it being found utterly impossible to take them any further. There they are gone, said Otter, as the last boatload set out under the charge of Peter. Well, let them go, the silly sheep. so much the less trouble for us, who, although we have a shepherdess, can scarcely lead so large a flock. Well, we have pulled the Missy yonder out of the slave nest, and the yellow devil, ah, we have talked with him and all his crew. And now, are we to go on to win the gold, the real yellow devil, boss?" "I suppose so, Otter," answered Leonard. "That is, if Soa keeps her word. But it isn't gold, it is rubies. At any rate, we must make for the settlement below Senna, to take these men back and see if we can hear anything of Mavoom." "So," said Otter after a pause. "Well, the shepherdess, as these settlement people call her, will want to find her father. Say, Baas, she is proud, is she not? She looks over our heads and speaks little." "Yes, Otter, she is proud." "And she is beautiful. No woman was ever so beautiful." "Yes, Otter, she is beautiful." "And she is cold, Baas. She does not say thank you nicely for all that you have done." "Perhaps she thinks it the more, Otter." "Perhaps she thinks it the more. Still she might say thank you to you, Baas, who are her husband." "What do you mean by that?" "I mean, Baas, that you bought her first according to our custom, and married her afterwards according to your own, and if that does not make her your wife, nothing can." "Stop that fool's talk," said Leonard angrily, "and never let me hear you repeat it. It was only a game that we played." "As the Baas desires, so be it. But I do speak from my heart when I say that she is your wife, and some might think that not so ill, for she is fair and clever. Will the Baas rise and come to the river to bathe, that his soreness may leave him?" Leonard took the suggestion and came back from his bath a new man, for rest and the cold water had acted on him like magic. He was still stiff indeed, and remained lame in one leg for 10 days or more, but, with the exception of an aching of the throat where Xavier had gripped him, no other ill effects were left. Among the booty of the slave camp was a good supply of clothing, flannel shirts, corduroy suits, and hats. Casting aside the rags of the Portuguese uniform in which he had disguised himself, Leonard put on some of these articles, and reappeared in the camp dressed like an ordinary English colonist, roughly indeed, but becomingly. Meanwhile Juanna had also been making her toilet, with the help of Soa, who took this opportunity to tell her mistress the history of her meeting with Leonard Outram. But, either from design or because she forgot to do so, she did not at this time tell her about the agreement which had been entered into between them. And yet Soa had never spoken fully to her mistress of her early life, or of the mysterious people of the mist from whom she sprang, though she had taught her the language they spoke. Perhaps, for reasons of her own, she did not think this a favourable occasion on which to begin the story. When Soa had finished, Juanna fell into a reverie. She remembered that she had expressed no gratitude to Mr. Outram for his heroic rescue of her. Yet in her heart she was grateful enough. But for him she must now have been dead, and the world of light and love would have closed its gates upon her for ever. Still, mixed up with her gratitude and earnest admiration of the deed of heroism which had been wrought for her sake, was another feeling, a feeling of resentment and alarm. This stranger, this dark, keen-eyed, resolute man had bought her as a slave. More, he had gone through the form of a marriage with her that was not all a form, for it had been solemnly celebrated by a priest, and there on her finger was the memorial of it. Of course it meant nothing, but the thought of it angered her and offended her pride. Like other women, Juanna Rodd had not come to 20 years of age without dreaming of love, and strange to say, her fancy had always chosen such a man as Leonard for the hero of her story. But that the hero should present himself in this ultra-heroic fashion, that he should buy her with gold, that he should go through a form of marriage with her within an hour of their first meeting. For these things she had not bargained. It was a fact that marriage was an accomplished fact, although it might be null and void, and the female mind has a great respect for accomplished facts. To a woman of Juanna's somewhat haughty nature this was very galling. Already she felt it to be so, and as time went on the chain of its remembrance irked her more and more, a circumstance which accounts for much of her subsequent conduct. Thinking such thoughts as these, Juanna strolled back toward the camp along a little pathway in the reeds, and suddenly she came face to face with Leonard. She was clad in a white Arab robe, part of the loot, which she had adapted cleverly to the purposes of a dress, fastening it round her slender waist with an embroidered scarf. She wore no hat, and her rich dark hair was twisted into a great knot that shone in the sunlight. In her hand she held some crimson lilies which she had gathered, that made a spot of colour on the whiteness of her dress. The look of haunting terror was gone from her face, whose beauty had come back during her sleep. Her changing eyes shone beneath their dark lashes, and she moved with the grace of a fawn. Seen thus in that pure and pearly light, against the green background of the feathered reeds, nothing could have seemed more sweet and lovely than did this girl, this child of the forest and the river, who mingled in herself the different beauty of the Saxon and the Spaniard, ripened by the African sun and dignified by the long companionship of nature. There was a grace about her movements, a purity in her face, a mystery in the wide eyes and curved and smiling lips, such as Leonard had never seen before, and which overcame him utterly. Alas, for the fickleness of the human heart! From that moment the adoration of his youth, the dream of his lonely years of wandering, Jane Beach, began to grow faint and fade away. But though this was so, as yet he did not admit it to himself. Indeed, he scarcely knew it. Juanna looked up and saw him standing before her, proud and handsome, an air of command upon his thoughtful face, deep-chested, bearded, vigorous, a man amongst men. She saw the admiration in his eyes and blushed, knowing that, do what she would to prevent it, it was reflected in her own. She remembered all this stranger had done for her, how he had risked his life 100 times, how she would now have been dead and unlovely were it not for his intrepid deeds, and remembering, something stirred at her heart. Was it gratitude that moved her thus? She did not know, but whatever it was, she turned her head that he might not read it on her face. Another moment, and she was holding out her hand to him and smiling pleasantly. "Good morning," she said. "I hope that you have slept well, and that you have no bad news." "I spent 8 hours in a state of absolute stupor," he answered, laughing, "and there is no news at all to speak of, except that I have got rid of those slaves, poor creatures. I fancy that our friends, the slave dealers yonder, have had enough of our company, and are scarcely likely to follow us." Juanna turned a shade paler and answered, "I trust so. At least, I have had enough of them. By the way, Mr. Outram, I have to thank you for a great deal," and her eyes caught the gleam of the gold circlet on the third finger of her left hand. "This ring belongs to you. I will return it at once." "Miss Rodd," said Leonard gravely, "we have passed through a very strange adventure together. Will you not keep the ring in remembrance of it?" Her strong impulse was to refuse. While she wore this ring, the thought of that hateful scene and still more hateful mockery of marriage would be always with her. And yet, as the words of prompt refusal were on her lips, a feeling, an instinct, almost a superstition, caused them to remain unspoken. "You are very kind," she said, "but this is your signet ring. Is it not that what you call it?" You cannot wish to give it to a chance acquaintance." "Yes, it is my signet ring, and if you will look at the crest and motto you will see that they are not inappropriate. And I do wish to give it even to a chance acquaintance, Miss Rodd, if you will allow me no more intimate term." "I have looked at them," she answered, as she examined the ring curiously. It was of plain and somewhat massive gold, and deeply cut into the shield-faced bezel was the Outram crest, a hand holding a drawn sword, beneath which the motto was engraved. "What is the last word of the motto?" she went on. "It is so rubbed that I cannot read it. For home, honour—" "And heart," said Leonard. Juanna blushed, though why the word heart should make her blush she knew not. "Well, I will wear the ring if you wish it, Mr. Outram, in memory of our adventure, that is, until you ask it back again," she said confusedly, then added with a change of tone, "there is one detail of the adventure that I hope you will not allude to more than you can avoid, for the recollection of it is most painful to me, probably more so even than to you." "I suppose you mean the ceremony of marriage, Miss Rodd." "I mean that wicked and abominable farce in which we were made to play a part," she answered passionately. "Most of the witnesses of that shameful scene are dead and cannot speak of it, and if you will keep your servant the dwarf silent, I will do the same by Father Francisco. Let it be forgotten by both of us." "Certainly, Miss Rodd," said Leonard, "that is, if anything so strange can be forgotten. And now, will you come to breakfast?" She bowed her head in assent and swept past him, the red lilies in her hand. "I wonder what hold she has over the priest," thought Leonard to himself, "that she talked of being able to keep him silent. By the way, I must find out whether we are to have the pleasure of his company. I would rather be without him myself. A strange girl. One can account for her beauty. She inherited that, but it is difficult to understand the manner. By rights she should be a half wild hoyden, but I never saw an English lady with more grace and dignity. Perhaps I have forgotten. It is so long since I associated with ladies, or perhaps, like beauty, these are natural to her. After all, her father seems to have been a gentleman of birth, and people who live with nature may have every fault in the calendar, but they cannot be vulgar. That is the gift of civilization. When he reached the camp, Leonard found the priest talking confidentially to Juanna. "By the way, Father," he said somewhat brusquely, "as you see, I have got rid of those slaves. It was impossible to take them with us, and now they must shift for themselves. At any rate, they are better off than they were yonder. What are your plans? You have behaved well to us, but I cannot forget that we found you in bad company. Perhaps you wish to return to it, and in that case your way lies eastward," and he nodded towards the nest. "I do not wonder that you distrust me, Señor," said Francisco, his pale and girlish face colouring as he spoke, "for appearances are much against me. But I assure you that although I came into the company of Antonio Pereira by my own will, it was for no evil purpose. To be brief, Señor, I had a brother who fled hither from Portugal because of a crime that he had committed, and joined Pereira's band. With much toil I tracked him out, and was welcomed at the Nest because I am a priest who can comfort the sick and shrive the dying, for wickedness does not counsel men at the last. Señor, I persuaded my brother to return with me, and we made a plan to escape. But Pereira's ears were long. We were betrayed, and my brother was hanged. They did not hang me because of my calling. Afterwards I was kept a prisoner and forced to accompany the band in their expeditions. That is all the story. Now, with your permission, I will follow you, for I have no money and nowhere else to go in this wilderness, though I fear that I am not strong enough to be of much service, and being of another faith, you will scarcely need my ministrations." "Very well, Father," answered Leonard coldly, "but please understand that we are still surrounded by many dangers, which any treachery might cause to overwhelm us. Therefore I warn you that should I detect anything of the sort, my answer to it will be a quick one." "I do not think you need to suspect the Father, Mr. Outram," said Juanna indignantly. "I owe him a great deal. Had it not been for his kindness and counsel, I should not be alive today. I am most deeply grateful to him." "If you vouch for him, Miss Rodd, that is enough. You have had the advantage of a closer acquaintance than I can boast," Leonard answered gravely, mentally contrasting the difference of her manner in acknowledging the priest's services and his own. From that hour till a certain conversation opened his eyes, struggle as he would against it, Leonard disliked Francisco. He had a foolish British aversion to his class, and Juanna's marked partiality toward this particular individual did not lessen in this instance. Prejudice is a strong thing, and when it is heightened by suspicion and jealousy, especially jealousy of the unacknowledged kind, it becomes formidable, both to him who entertains it and to him against whom it is entertained. When their meal was done they proceeded up the river in the boats which they had captured from the slavers, each boat being rowed by the best oarsmen among the settlement men. Including women and children, their party numbered some 60 souls. At evening they passed the island where they had left the company of slavers, but could see no sign of life upon it, and never learned whether the men perished or escaped. An hour later they encamped upon the bank of the river, and it was while they were sitting round the fire at night that Juanna told Leonard of the horrors which she had undergone during her dreadful sojourn with the slave caravan. She told him also how she had torn leaves from the Bible which she chanced to have with her, and fixed them upon the reeds whenever she could find an opportunity of doing so, in the hope that they might guide her father, should he return and attempt her rescue. "It is all like a nightmare," she said, "and as for that hideous farce of the marriage with which it ended, I can scarcely bear to think of it." Then Francisco, who had been sitting silent, spoke for the first time. "You speak, Senora," he said in his subdued voice, "of that hideous farce of a marriage, and I suppose you mean the ceremony which I performed between you and the Señor Outram, being forced to act by Pereira. It is my duty to tell you both, however irregular this marriage may have been, I do not believe it to be a farce. I believe that you are lawfully man and wife until death shall part you, unless indeed the Pope should annul the union, as he alone can do." "Nonsense, nonsense," broke in Leonard. "You forget that there was no consent, that we are of another religion, and that the form was necessary to our plot. The Church knows nothing of the reasons which lead to the undertaking of wedlock," Francisco answered mildly. "They are various, and many of them would not bear investigation. But you are married without any open protest on your part, on Portuguese territory, according to Portuguese custom, and by a duly qualified priest. The fact that you are of the Protestant religion and were united by the Catholic ritual does not matter at all. For the purpose of the ceremony you accepted that ritual, as is customary when a Protestant marries a Catholic. It is disagreeable to me to have to tell you this, but the truth remains. I believe that you are man and wife before heaven and the world." Here Juanna jumped to her feet, and even in that light Leonard could see that her breast was heaving and her eyes shone with anger. "It is intolerable that I should be forced to listen to such falsehoods," she said, "and if you ever again repeat them in my hearing, Father Francisco, I will not speak to you again. I utterly repudiate this marriage. Before the ceremony began, Mr. Outram whispered to me to go through with the farce, and it was a farce. Had I thought otherwise, I should have taken the poison. If there is any foundation for what the Father says, I have been deceived and entrapped." "Pardon, Senora," replied the priest, "but you should not speak so angrily. The Senor Outram and I only did what we were forced to do." "Supposing that Father Francisco is right, which I do not believe," said Leonard with sarcasm, "do you think, Miss Rodd, that such a sudden undertaking would be more to my liking than to yours? Believe me, had I wished to deceive and entrap you, I could not have done so without involving myself, since if the marriage is binding, it is binding on both parties, and even such a humble individual as I am does not take a wife on the faith of 5 minutes' acquaintance. To be frank, I undertook your rescue for purposes far other than those of matrimony." "May I ask what they were?" replied Juanna, in a tone of equal acerbity. "Certainly, Miss Rodd, but first I must explain that I am no knight errant. I am an almost penniless adventurer, and for urgent reasons of my own I seek to win fortune. Therefore, when the woman yonder," and he pointed to Soa, who was sitting watching them just out of range of the firelight, "came to me with a marvellous tale of countless treasures of rubies, which she promised to reveal to me if I would undertake the little matter of your rescue, and when she even paid down a specimen stone of considerable value on account, having nothing better to do and nowhere to go, being in short desperate, I consented. Indeed, I did more. I took the precaution of reducing the matter to writing, I being one contracting party, and Soa, acting on her own behalf and as your attorney, being the other." "I have not the least idea to what you allude to, nor did I ever give Soa any authority to sign documents on my behalf. But may I see this writing?" "Certainly," Leonard answered, and rising he went to the baggage, whence he returned presently with a lantern and the prayer book. Juanna placed the lantern beside her and opened the book. The first thing that she saw was a name on the flyleaf, Jane Beach, and beneath it this inscription, which evidently had been written by someone in a great hurry: "To dearest Leonard, from Jane, 23 January." "Turn over," he said hastily, "the document is on the other side." But she was not slow to note both the writing and the confusion which her perusal of it had caused him. Who was Jane Beach, she wondered, and why did she call Mr. Outram dearest Leonard? In a moment, so strange are the hearts of women, Juanna felt herself much prepossessed against her, whoever she might be. But she turned the leaf and read the agreement. It was a pretty sight to see her bending over the cramped writing in the circle of the lantern light, but when at length she had finished and looked up, there was a smile upon her lovely face which had more of scorn in it than was pleasant. "Come hither, Soa," she said, "and tell me what all this nonsense means about rubies and the people of the mist." "Shepherdess," answered Soa, squatting down on the ground before her, "it is not nonsense. The language which I taught you when you were little is that of this people. It is a true tale, though hitherto I have hid it from you and your father, Mavoom, lest Mavoom should seek to win the precious stones and come to his death through them. Listen, Shepherdess," and she repeated the outlines of the story with which she had already made Leonard acquainted, and ended thus: "I told this tale to the white man because I saw that he was greedy, after the fashion of his race, and my strait was desperate. For this reason I bribed him with the red stone, and with a promise that I would lead him to the land of the people of the mist, for had I not done so, he would never have used his wit or put out his strength to rescue you from the yellow devil. Therefore it was also that I marked this paper on your behalf and my own, knowing well that I had no right to speak for you, and that by and by you could refuse to abide by it, though I am bound." "Frank, at any rate," said Leonard to himself. What an attorney the old lady would have made! "Say, Soa," asked Juanna, "to succeed in the search for these stones, is it necessary that I should act a part among your people?" "I can see no other way," she answered. "But what of that? You are free, and what I promised on your behalf is nothing. Let the white man go without his reward. It will save him a long journey." "Attorney," murmured Leonard in admiration. "She ought to be Attorney General." "Wow, the wicked old cheat," put in Otter. "If I had my way I would break her neck, though she is so clever with the big gun." Juanna took no notice of these asides. For the moment she remained in thought, then looked up smiling. "Really," she said, "this is a capital legal document. But oh, Mr. Outram, why did you dispel my illusions? You see, I had been making up such a romantic story out of this adventure. You were the knight errant, and I the Christian maiden in the hands of the ogre, and when you heard of it you buckled on your armour and started to the rescue, and now you bring me down to the 19th century with a run. It is not knight errantry, but a commercial transaction. I am in difficulty, but by playing a certain undefined part, you believe that I shall be able to help you to secure a treasure. Therefore you agree to undertake the risk. I am ignorant of what I am to do, for as yet nobody has explained it to me. But you need have no fear. I shall not repudiate, as Soa suggests, with so much candour. Certainly I shall try my best to help you in this business, if I can, for you have worked hard and endangered your life, Mr. Outram, and I am sure that you have earned your money, or rather the prospect of it. Really, it is all very amusing," and she laughed merrily. As for Leonard, he sat before her, mad with secret wrath and burning with shame. What a fool he had been thus to expose himself to the shafts of this girl's tongue, this girl whose beauty was only equalled by her malice. He wished that his hand had withered before he wrote that accursed document, but now the only thing to do was to face it out. "I am glad that you see me in my true light at last, Miss Rodd," he said. "It simplifies matters. I entered into that agreement because it seemed to give me a remote chance of attaining my end, which is money. It does not quite follow, however, that I should not have attempted your rescue had there been no agreement, but of course I cannot expect you to believe that." "I assure you, Mr. Outram, that I am deeply obliged to you for your caution. It has lifted a great weight from my mind, for if in any way I can help you to obtain possession of the valuables of this people of the mist, I shall have paid off an obligation which at present crushes me." "We shall have to start early tomorrow morning, so with your permission I think that I will be turning in," said Leonard, springing up with singular alacrity. Juanna watched him go with innocent eyes, and as he passed she saw by the firelight that his face was like a thunderstorm. "I have made him angry this time," she thought to herself, "and I am glad of it. What business had he to rescue me for money? But he is a strange man, and I don't think that I quite understand him. I wonder who Jane Beach is. I suppose she wants the money. Women generally do, or at least they did in Durban." Then she spoke aloud. "Soa, come here while I undress, and tell me again about your meeting with Mr. Outram, and what he said, forgetting nothing. You have put me to shame, Soa, with your talk, and I will never forgive you. Tell me also how I can help him to win the treasure of the people of the mist." End of chapter 15.